Vishwa is an online platform. It's for everyday change makers, social champions who have been serving decades to make a difference and to make our world a better place. It's a crowdfunding and a crowdsourcing platform. We connect people who would like to make a difference with those people who would like to donate, volunteer, or give away materials and that they are not using and would like to put it under circulation.
Roshni has given life to the noble thought, psychiatry at your doorstep. With this project, we are reaching the unreachable, the underprivileged. And in this noble journey, Vishwa has been with us. Thanks a lot to Vishwa, who has helped us to reach people and also to raise funds.
WishwaTalks is an initiative by Wishwa.org. WishwaTalks are a series of weekly webinars hosted every Saturday that are focused on gaining in-depth knowledge from the experts on a wide range of topics that are pertinent to the current context.
One of the best collaborations that I had in 2021 is with WishwaTalks.
WishwaTalks is a wonderful platform, both for the speakers and the listeners. They cover varied topics, right from mental health to the environment. And it's so informative and so enjoyable.
All these are very enriching, and I congratulate Vishwa organization for their endeavors, and I wish them all the best for many more sessions.
Hello, good morning, namaskaram, and welcome everyone to Vishwa Talks. My name is Prerna, and I thank you for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who have attended a Vishwa Talk before, a warm welcome back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, here is a little bit about us. Vishwa Talks is a space to expand the horizons of your mind. Every webinar, we call experts from different domains to discuss and examine opinions, issues, problems, and perspectives. Each webinar is an interactive session where we all walk away with more respect for each other and a deeper understanding of the topic at hand. Today on Vishwa Talks, we have a dignified speaker, Dr. Swarnamalya Ganesh. Today we'll understand how South Asian music, dance, and performance can be invaluable source of stored knowledge and history. Dr. Swarnamalya is a combination of a performer with over 35 years of experience, a scholar of dance history, as well as a trained academician in art, practice, and sociology. Her PhD dissertation was on research and reconstruction of lost dance repertories of early modern South Indian Nayak period. In a pioneering effort, she studied in depth the history and sources involved in the lost performing traditions to reconstruct them. From the Attic is a performance, lecture, exhibition series based on her research. From collaboration with artists of various genres to reflecting multicultural historicity of dance and music in South India. FTA stands as a unique voice that speaks of inclusivity and harmony as inherent values of performing traditions. She has aligned her practice and teaching of dance as sadhana, the subaltern form of Bharatanatyam. She and her work through gender, culture, society, stigma, and political movement. She is a senior disciple of Guru Kalaimanaman, K.J. Sarasa, and Vera Malai Muthukunamal. She has books and article publications to her credit and has produced DVDs of her work. She's also a well-known actor and a media person in Indian cinema and television. We are honored to have you on WishwaTalks, ma'am. Before we get started, I would like to inform our audience that our speaker will be taking questions from you after her main talk. So please leave your questions in the chat box or raise a hand, and we will allow you to ask your questions in person. Now, without further ado, if I may invite our speaker to please start today's Vishwa Talk.
A very good morning to everyone here. I hope I'm audible and visible.
Yes.
It's such a pleasure to be back for the WishwaTalks series. Primarily because I appreciate very much the kind of work that Vishwas is doing. Society needs as many people as we can muster to bring together not just various aspects of life, but also people who can make a meaningful change to that. And towards that, I think crowdfunding or crowdsourcing is a very new age commercial venture that will allow for dreams to come true, for realities to be better. So I really congratulate WishwaTalks for their initiative and for their work. And what you are doing in extension to bring so many experts from across various fields together is also extremely commendable, because I think it is this that really feeds into your work, right? For the fact that you're able to bring so many pulsating conversations across different fields. So I'm very happy to be here. It's my second conversation for WishwaTalks, and the first one was extremely enjoyable. And so here I am. And I want to welcome all of our participants for the day. So many of you have joined me. Thank you so much. This morning promises to be very engaging for me, although it's going to be a monologue for at least quite a bit. But we will have an opportunity to engage soon, I hope, because the topic that I have chosen to speak to you about is very close to my heart for two reasons. It is very strongly based on my own long years of research, starting from my doctoral work, but also has taken a very interesting socio-cultural historical extension. Research is never stagnant. So once I had a certain vision of the artistic history of what I was researching, I think I very quickly also started delving more on the socio-cultural historical aspects purely. Until then, these were all aiding my research in the performance. But now performance was aiding my research in history and psychology and sociopolitical readings. And so this particular research, which is, in fact, I think fresh from the oven, one can say, because I have just, my research work has been submitted and just been admitted to become part of a double-peered journal internationally. So this particular work, Performing Histories, is an extension of not only my work, but also bringing together a thought that will help many of us here. Maybe some of you are artists, maybe some of you are researchers, maybe some of you are social scientists here, to look at not so traditional sources, unorthodox sources amidst us, as also valuable resources for our research. So without further ado, now to preface the work that I do, let me ask you to think about something. Traditionally, when research scholars think of research material or sources for research, they immediately go to works that are scientifically or historically very specifically meant as historical texts. That is also true of researchers in the arts, right? So we always look for research material that comes with a certain scientific, when I say scientific, I mean an analytical background, or with strong recommended ways of reading society. Of course, in the long history of India and its many interpretations by whom we call as Orientalists today, Orientalists are people who have a strong interest in Asia, who are very interested in knowing and writing and commenting on about Asia. We still have a lot of Orientalists around the world, but in the colonial period, of course, there were several people who were engaged in Oriental studies. We continue to do so. And then there are Indologists who are specifically working on India. And so people like that, as well as people who claimed to be historians of that era. And I mean,
Ma'am, I think your voice, you went on mute now.
oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Again on mute.
No, somebody is muting me. I'm not muting myself. Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am. Perfect.
Okay. So several of these people, Indologists and Orientalists particularly, but historians in general, wrote and spoke and propounded theories that effectively said that India is ahistoric. Now, what we mean by that? Historicity is where there is a lot of history, and then the people and the atmosphere and the context and especially the people in the society are very aware of this historicity. You have a sense of knowledge. You have a sense of your history. You have a sense of the understanding of so I could narrate what is historicity a bit more, but this is peripherally what historicity means. Now, we were told that India was ahistoric. I'll just give you one example, right? So there was a person, an Orientalist, whose name was James Mill. In 1817, he wrote a 3-volume text called History of British India, right? The fun part of this was James famous
Ma'am, sorry, you're on mute.
I think somebody else is muting me, Prerna. I am not muting.
I understand, ma'am. I'm looking into that. Please continue.
Thank you. Right. So James Mill, no less, proclaimed that you don't, oh God, travel the length and breadth of this country. It's enough if you are able to have a certain analytical sense. So they really thought of their pursuit as analytical and scientific. And he, for example, was one of the primary reasons for creating this historical period or dividing Indian history or India's past as Hindu, Muslim, and British. Right? We hear a lot of these, right? We hear a lot of this analogy in our understanding of history today, right? We've been fed with these ideas that there was a Hindu past, and then there was a Muslim past, and then, of course, there is the British past. It's very easy for us, even in terms of classroom textbook chapterization. That is how we teach our young people how Indian history is to be interpreted. But what we don't realize is someone like James Mill to contribute to their own growth is very, very minimal. Right? He said that, individualism or nationalistic progress is very difficult because we are a group of or a conglomerate of villages, right, who are held by age-old traditions, and therefore we are anathemic to progress. Right? Now, the minute I say something like this, you might immediately as a patriot, as an Indian, you might be very upset, and you might say, no, what is this? Bharat, India, we are so rich in culture. But this is not just James Mill. over several years, many of them, many Orientalists did put forth, based one on each other's theory, such an idea that India is ahistorical. Now, were they all completely wrong? We'll come to the historicity part a bit later, but somebody like James Mill and his work, for all the follies that it had, or for all the theories that it had propounded, and the Hegelian theory of thinking that India has no chance to progress ahead, one thing was very, there were interesting, what we can call as collaterals that came out of, say, works like this. For example, James Mill work was used to talk about the very evil practice of sati in India, and therefore, it brought on a conversation in the public domain about how the world looks at India because of such regressive practices. But those collaterals that were somewhat positive aside, Orientalists and the world at large, especially when history as a stream of discipline was developing so much, really looked at India as historic. Forget about all the, because they thought inscriptions were all, based on some kind of fallacy. There were all kinds of evidence that they were willing to overlook. But the good news is, over the last maybe 70 years, we've had wonderful historians amidst us who have steadfastly deconstructed such a misnomer. So many of them. Romila Thapar, for example, right? A.K. Vardhan, for example, Nicholas Dirks, for example, are all some historians who very strongly said that hidden between the grandiose of Puranic stories and folklore and courtly narratives and darbar and all of these fancy grandeurs are in fact eloquently written historical narratives. These become sources for historical evidence, if nothing else, they said. Many other historians, Indian, many, but also non-Indian thereafter, of course, continued to thrive on this rejection of the ahistorical tag to India. And therefore, people like Sanjay Subramaniam and David Schulman and Velchuri Narayan Rao, of course, beautifully brought on many other evidence-based research that continue to show that India is in fact not ahistorical, but has several ways of interpreting history. One of the evidence that they brought on was literary sources. Now, we always consider, even when I ask you, I'm sure, and you can respond to this perhaps as even a question as I put forth this now, because I feel like I'm just going on a monologue. When you come across a piece of literature, let's say the Ramayana, forget about the Ramayana because that's, it's overdetermined. Let's take any other literature, right? Do you ever think of Indian literatures as solid historical evidence? It's another thing to be a believer. I'm not asking you about your belief. Now, someone, if you say Bhagavata Purana, or if you say the Bhagavad Gita, and if you think that the Bhagavad Gita has in fact happened, right? That is your faith and belief. That's not what I'm asking about, right? And then you ascertain a certain date and time to it and all that. But what I'm asking you is literary texts that are based on certain narratives of people that have actually happened. Let us take, for example, the Akbarnama or the Jahangirnama. I'm just giving you examples off the top of my head. So do these chronicles written on the lives of kings, the autobiographies of courtly life, written by chieftains and sages and different people, different ascetics in a particular kingdom. Do you think any of this has historical value? Forget about literary value. Literary value, yes, right? But do they have historical value? Now, the question more often than not in a serious context, as an enthusiast of the nation, you may say, yes, I think this is all very historical because my grandmother asked me to believe it. That's not what I'm asking, right? But if you were to see this from an analytical perspective, the answer most often than not is, no, literary texts tend to exaggerate a lot, and therefore they cannot be considered as serious historical evidence. So a serious historian will refrain from quoting from historical texts, from literary texts, because they're not often considered as reliable sources, right? So people such as these historians I just mentioned, especially the trio, Sanjay Subramaniam, David, and Narayan Rao, have worked extensively in the past years to deconstruct that and showcase, in fact, how certain literary texts, let us take Kalhana's work, Rajatarangini, to any other work that has only literary value until thus far, how it in fact has a historical value. So they've analyzed these in detail, in minute detail, to showcase how these texts that have only literary value, only poetic value, in fact have very, very important details strewn across them that make them historically very, very important. Now, poets and composers and accountants and chroniclers of these literary texts are often not considered as traditional historians, right? So we also tend to discount who writes it and therefore the work itself, right? Because you tend to think, what can an accountant, what can Jaya Senapati know, in fact, about the Kakatiya dynasty? I mean, he was only a Senapati. How could he have had such intrinsic knowledge about the music and dance and the courtly life of that time? Could be one of the discussions when it comes to looking at it from a historical lens. But in fact, these people have time and again, not just once, not just with one fluke of a text, but time and again proved that these are texts that can be, but you have to know how to close read them. Now that is the challenge. So now in my performing histories research, this is where I'm coming to my work. In the long tradition of all of these historians who have established thus far, who laid the path for all of us, I further this analysis of literary texts to include in them vernacular performative literatures, such as Abhyudayamu-s, Yakśagānamu-s, Vachakamu-s, etc. And also, additionally with them, because they are performative literatures, the very performance of these literatures. Now you may wonder, now you have a literary text in your hand. You may say, okay, so this is historical evidence. Can I go through this text? I know how to close read it. Can I identify and bring out some of the historical aspects of what I want to say? Indeed, absolutely. But what I argue for in my new research is that a better part of its historicity is in the performance itself. Why? Because these texts were primarily meant to be performed. A performative text, even though it's in a text form, is meant to be performed. Let me further explain. Say you have a Raghunatha Abhyudayamu. That's the text I'm going to give you as an example for the day. Raghunatha Abhyudayamu, which is a text written by Vijayaraghava Nayaka, one of the Nayaka kings of Tañjāvur, whose father was Raghunatha Nayaka. And this text written by the son on the father, an Abhyudayamu in Telugu literally means the dawn to dusk life of a king. These are not new. Vijayaraghava was not the first to write an Abhyudayamu. There is Achyutaraya Abhyudayamu, there is Achyuta Abhyudayamu. There are many other Abhyudayamus, all fashioned on the namas written for the Mughal and the Sultanate kings. Again, fashioned on several other ways of chronicling that comes to us from Iraq and other places. The Middle East, as we call it now, or the West Asians, as we might like to call them. Now, what is exciting about the Raghunatha Abhyudayamu is the text may be available to you. I mean, today, because there is the Saraswati Mahal has indeed printed a text, it may be available. But what you're able to gather from the text as historicity may be about 15% of what the text is meant to give. The rest of it is all embedded or embodied through the performance. How do we know this? We also get this information from the very same text. The text actually tells you that the Abhyudayamu, not just Raghunatha Abhyudayamu, but also Achyuta Abhyudayamu and later on Vijayaraghavanaika Abhyudayamu and all of these Abhyudayamus were in time performed in the courts of these Nayaka kings, not once, but over and over and over again. So in the performance of these texts lies a very, very important quality that has indeed been lost to us. God knows for the last 150, at least 150 years. Right? So the sequencing of the dawn to dusk life of a Telugu Nayaka king, it's fashioned very much on Namas and Vachakamus. The Abhyudayamu surely dips into mytho-history. I'm not suggesting that's entirely historical, as in it does not have an element of exaggeration or literary justice, poetic justice. Of course, the mytho-history is there, popular and fantastic motifs and modes of description of extraordinary life of the king are indeed present. But the text is of historical value, as the Nayaka kings were feudatories who rose to a ruling status, bringing new norms to Tamilagam, right? And so the text is by itself very valuable. These people emulated the Rayas and the Nawabs and their lifestyle, but also displayed a certain sense of individuality, right? That came from the fact that these kings belonged to a particular caste that was very different from the then ruling class. Now you may wonder, why is all this relevant? Can't we get all this in, today if you Google, you get everything, right? Because somebody or the other is, piecemealing information from somewhere and then, putting it together on Google. But much worse, you're able to get, short, I just think historical snippets on these Insta reels and things like that, as wonderful and entertaining as they are, somehow, makes someone think that that's the entirety of what's available. It's not, right? Because it's just 50 seconds. Please remember that anything that you see there on social media is 50 seconds. Even if it's 50 minutes, it's still not enough. It's not exhaustive. But suffice to say that the grandeur of the king's life that you see in a text, particularly say in an Abhyudayamu, where the king wakes up in the morning and he's getting ready and, he's about to embark on his day and there are all these ministers and there is this grand. Now you might wonder what is so historical about all this. It's literary, I understand. It's very beautiful. Let me, Rarajani Achyutendru Raghunathan Ripa, Yerine Sarirajulu, Ru Ramanulu, Ninnu Chala Pogadu Durubadi, Swarajani, Rarajani Achyutendru Raghunathan Ripa. Now, when I say this, when I recite this Dvipada, you might think this is beautiful. You might say this is poetic. You might even want to set this to music and sing. But where is the history in this might be your question. And when I say you, I mean serious historians, right? Because we are, as people who are in the field of performance, we are constantly trying to collaborate with other aspects of society. Sociologists, psychologists, historians, so that art becomes relevant for them and their field and their work also permeates into art, and therefore there is a very healthy collaboration. Unless there is this kind of collaboration, there's hardly any growth, right? So when I have these conversations, when I recite this Dvipada to any serious historian, they might brush it aside as wonderful poetry, but not anything more. But that's where the performance of it comes together, right? So the fact that there are statistical data, there are factual narratives, there are minute details embedded within these kinds of performative texts, firsthand reported by a son of his father's life. Just imagine, today we value biographies and autobiographies, right? This is a biography of a father, of a son, but of his father. Right? And it has minute details. Yes, there may be grandiosity, but there is also historical narrative waiting to be sieved from this, right? So through a textured reading, and I think that's very critical, through a good, learned, analytical textured reading of these Abhyudayamu-s and even Yakśagānamu-s and several other vernacular texts. And I say vernacular because Sanskritic texts have a very different flavor, to which I'll come. Pollock and others have analyzed that in depth, and I have seen those, but I'm more inclined to think of the vernacular texts as more important because they are far more neglected than, Sanskritic texts. One can trace an emerging historical consciousness of the time. Now, why is this important? Because India was not ahistorical. We had a historical consciousness. And how do we identify this historical consciousness? Because the king was a central figure and he was illustrated as a hero, a true hero of the time. And there is a distinct performative quality of song and dance through which this central mode or the central figure is constantly expressed. It extols Raghunatha's greatness through historical conquests, his administrative prowess, warfare genius, his processions, cultural and romantic alliances. All of this was indeed a way of reporting history because it may not have happened on the exact same day that this was written. I'm not suggesting, but it happened, right? And where else will you gather? The only other historical, it's amazing how we've taken the historical narratives of foreign travelers far sooner as historical narratives than these literary texts, right? So we are okay with taking a Robert Sewell's understanding of the Vijayanagara Empire far sooner than we would give Vijayaraghavan Nayaka the credit for chronicling the life of his own father, right? So the native cultural ecology, and this is very critical, the native cultural ecology of the reader and the spectator in this case, but also the reader and the spectator transform into something very, very important to which I'll come very soon, right? The native cultural ecology of the reader and the spectator really allows them an intuitive ability to know when past is rendered to them in a factual manner. And to me, this is the crux of what we say. So who is able to read this as history? When you're performing your history around you, when you're performing history, who is able to read them as history? These are people who watch these performances every day, the subjects of the court, people who are, that's why I said vernacular language, people who read Tamil, people who read Telugu, people who read the language in which the particular literature, performative literature is written, people who understand the performance. They are, how does dance reflect history? Okay, so I'm going to come to that. I think I'll take questions in a bit. But going back to this, thank you very much for those questions. Right? The fact that there is a native ecology and that native people who understand the language, who understand the ethos, have an intuitive ability, makes these texts not just performative, but a performance of history. And that's very critical because why were they dancing? Tell me, why would, Vijayaraghavan Nights, he writes a text. Okay, it's fantastic. He was given the Sahitya Pendara by his father because he was he had such great prowess in poetic writing. But can that be the only reason why a particular Raghunatha Nayaka, Abhyudayamu, much after even Raghunatha's demise, was continued to be performed in the Nayaka court? Every day, day after day. They speak as if in these very texts, they speak as if these texts were performed every single day, either as recitation, as singing, as musical concerts, and as performative dance, right? Theatrical. The idea is the native reader, and in this case, the native reader now at this point effectively becomes the native viewer because you're viewing something, you're listening to something, you are a participant. You are not just merely a reader, but you become a spectator, right? You are spectating, you are part of the performance in some sense because you are also included. You are the subject. You are the subject to whom he is king. So this Nayaka life, and I'm taking this only as an example, you can take this particular theory and place it in any vernacular performative literature, and you might invariably perhaps arrive at some similar solutions or conclusions, right? They become important pieces of puzzle to inform how communities were viewing their present through the king and the past of the king, of their own self, of their kingdom, of their society. Using various ways, which are all modes of performance. So what I have done through this research is effectively taken a text and done a minute close lens reading of every aspect of it to look at its historical value. But even as I did that, I realized that the historical value does not only lie in the literature, because the literature, as I said, either in manuscript or printed form, still remains inactivated. It's still words lying on paper, right? But the actual historical narrative, or the better part of the historical narrative, let's put it that way, is in fact in the performance itself. And it's not merely in the singular, I can't take it and I can't perform it one day or recite it one day and expect it to impact our life in a historical manner. It is in the repetitive quality, and somebody like Walter Benjamin talks about the idea of repetition, and I've used his analysis of literary criticism to also understand how repetition plays a very critical role in ensuring that this historical consciousness in the minds of the viewer is reiterated over and over and over again. Therefore, to deconstruct or to dismantle the James Miller idea that all of our texts and our India in itself is, opposed to the idea of dynamic progress and is somewhat couched in an unchanging despotic rule, because the minute we say rulers and we say kings, and these are all small-time, the Nayakas are small-time feudatory kings, who lived in what looks as apparent luxury and grandeur. People usually tend to set them aside as despotic rulers, right? Because of whom perhaps even we rendered ourselves in the hands of foreign rule, or I think I'll take that back into British rule. I won't say foreign, because who's foreign and who is not. However, equally limiting will be the understanding that these texts are reservoirs of all traces of the past. So I'm not here to propound that if you have a historical performative text like an Abhyudayamu or Yakśagānamu, then you're set. You can actually go and write the entire history of the time and era most effectively. No. But it's a process. As part of many other literary sources, you must very well also consider performative literatures and performance. And therefore, in order to place them in context, we will use two techniques. And I have used this in recreating this performance. It's called mnemotechniques and mnemotechnologies. Now, these are, again, from social sciences. It's from the idea that society, right, commemorates a range of its memories. It could be all the way from rituals to historical writing. And it initiates what we now call as cultural memory, right? And this was, we've been talking about cultural memory, from 1980s onwards. Memory is not a passive deposit, right? It's not as if you have one thing in your mind and it stays there static, as static memories, right? It's a part of reiteration and metamorphosis that happens to you and to people around you over and over again, which is why 10 years after something has happened, when you remember it slightly differently. They say time is kinder to you, right? So if something has happened to you and you remember it 10 years later, the intensity of that might vary, which is also why through performance, repeated performance, you reiterate the past in a manner where that memory is fresh, it's continuous, and it develops an identity of its own that is so strong generationally amidst people. So it is in that repetitive performative quality. Because when I give you a book, you might read it just once and you might let it go, right? But if you watch a performance every day in court, you are watching it every day, you're listening to it every day, you're singing along. Why do you think songs appeal to people more? Cinema songs especially, because you're repetitively listening to it. Wherever you go, you're listening to it. And it becomes part of your memory cycle. So very similarly, performance itself has rendered its services to the idea of building cultural memory continuously, not as a passive depository, but in fact as a mechanism of textual creation. So it is through the performance, in fact, that you go back to textual creation. And this is where, I'm sorry, this is where I will take, I have taken the work of social scientists or anthropologists like Jan Assmann, who propounds the cultural memory theory, where she talks about how the idea of this memory is really, or this cultural memory is defined as comprising a body of reusable texts, and reusable becomes our key word, right? Operational word, and images and rituals specific to each society in each epoch, whose cultivation serves to establish and convey that society's self-image, right? And that was, quoting from her. So, your self-image, who are you? Who are you as a society? Are you Nayaka society? If you're Nayaka society, how do you define yourself as Nayaka? Isn't that the job of historians, to define Nayaka society, right? To identify what is a cultural society. What is a society? How do you say this particular kingdom? You write histories about different kingdoms. How do you identify the cultural identity and even the political identity of any particular kingdom without so much as your ability to look at all their texts and images and rituals that are so specific and indeed so unique to them, right? So the idea of cultural memory indeed has to be built through the very many different literary works we have. But instead of looking at them as merely literatures that serve us only the purpose of understanding their poetic and artistic endeavors, we take this a bit further to understand how, as political beings, as indeed individuals, how do each person in a society, in a particular era, build themselves through these performances and performative literatures. Now, how is this relevant to us today? Let me just tell you. So if you're living in your society now, say if you're living in Hyderabad, if you're living in Chennai, and you think that, your identity, when someone asks you what's your identity and you say, I'm so and so, I'm a woman, or I'm a man, or whatever, and then place identity, you say, I love television, I love TV by only or own self identity. In very
Ma'am, I think your voice is breaking into
historical. Now I need to go into the specific today.
Ma'am, I think there's a network issue. Your voice is breaking. Okay. I think there was a network glitch at Swarnamalya ma'am's end. While we are fixing that issue, she is coming back. I'll request my audience to please answer quick poll question. This poll question is for us to understand what kind of topic you want, what kind of cause should we bring up next. Should we talk about mental health, or should we talk about art and culture, different forms of dances or sculptures next? Please answer these questions, and it will help us curate better topics and help us bring. Yes, I think ma'am is back. Please give go to ma'am. Please give co-host to ma'am. Yes.
Yes. I'm so sorry. I don't even know what happened.
I think there was some network glitch, ma'am. Your voice started, there was a glitch in your voice and then suddenly you were disconnected.
God, I'm so sorry.
Ma'am, please continue.
Okay. Anyway, I think that was a good break from my monotonous voice. But either way, let's just continue. I think I'll dive directly into Raghunatha Abhyudayamu now. I've given you a little bit of a background of what this research, the performing histories research is. But we'll take the square example of the Abhyudayamu, Raghunatha Abhyudayamu in particular, a Telugu manuscript found at the Saraswati Mahal, written by Vijayaraghava Nayaka. So here, Vijayaraghava brings a recollection to the mind of the reader, viewer in this case, not only of his father Raghunatha, but he very cleverly brings the identity of Raghunatha enmeshed in the classical aesthetic ideals of the characters that we know and love from our Kavya, Rama and Krishna. He also creates an experience of an ideal life of his father, of the Nayaka court, right? Naturally, I mean, that's where we run the risk of everyone telling us, no, this is too much of an exaggeration. This can't have been true. Nobody could have been, such a great person, and so on and so forth. But the loose distinction that he leaves between himself, the patron, the composer, and the hero of the work really makes for us to understand that, when you read it, you will understand, or when you see it as a performative work, you will understand that it reinvents some of these characters, some of these pasts, even this most ideal character of Rama and Krishna, ideals or idols and ideals, not in their original form, but in very different, new, hybrid manners. Now, what do I mean by that? So, you know what Rama takes credit for. Rama is courageous. Rama is the most glorified prince of all times. He was the most straightforward, most steadfast. He was indeed a paragon of chastity, right? Because he lived all through with Sita and he lived for Sita. So it was the exemplary character of Rama is invoked in Raghunatha. So you will think of Raghunatha as Rama. But that does not stop Vijayaraghava from showing the actual life of Raghunatha, which was filled with the women of his life, right? He had beautiful relationships with several of them. He had two consorts, Kalavatama and Lakshmama, right? But Raghunatha's multiple ways of interacting with the very many women in his court, right? The fact that this particular work itself, the Abhyudayamu, ends with one of the courtesans, Chitrarekha, falling madly in love with Raghunatha, and Raghunatha actually going and spending the evening with her, right? Clearly brings out the idea that this is Rama, but it's not Rama in the classical Ramayana form. This is Rama who can also be Krishna. He is Krishna because he is dallying with so many women. But he's also Rama because he is a great bhakta of the Ramayana. He reads the Balakandam every day, right? So you're torn between understanding who this characterization really is. But what you know is this character is a living, breathing character. Remember that these texts were not written for posterity. These were written for their times. This is like someone writing their own biography even as they are alive. You know the person. You've seen the person. You've interacted with that person. You live with that person. All the incidents that the person talks to you about are moments that you know. And yet when you read it, when you watch it as a performance, of course, biographies are read largely now, but imagine a biography that is enacted to you as a play, maybe as a performance, right? You relive that moment. Why? I mean, let's take the example of Kashmir Files, right? I mean, it was a moment of some sort of a memory of sorts that they were trying to rekindle in people. Take any, after the 9/11, I think, tragedies, so many movies were made. In parallel time, people who were part of the tragedy, people who had lost loved ones. COVID brought on so many different kinds of movies and different kinds of performative works. We know COVID. We know the anxiety that goes with COVID. There may have been an element of exaggeration in the film. There may have been a slightly different portrayal, but we also know we know how to sieve the truth. It's an intuitive knowledge that we have as native people, as people who've been part of that experience. Therefore, Raghunatha can be Rama and Krishna, but he's also Raghunatha. So he's partly divine, but he's also partly human. Right? So this partly divine, partly human characterization of a living, breathing king, an idealized construct, and not merely a living king, but an idealized construct, both of which make him an alluring personality. Cultural memory is often governed by a logic of relevance that gives priority to certain aspects of the past. So if you ask me, what I remember of my childhood, I may remember some of the most important moments, some of the key moments, both good and bad, but there will be key moments, right? The same goes for anyone. Therefore, Raghunatha Abhyudayamu focuses on the multiple ways in which the Nayaka imagery can be highlighted in the minds of its viewer. So members of their community will sit together, watch, listen, recite the Abhyudayamu as ways of remembering the key moments. So it's like highlights, right? So you want to remember the most important. They're not always shiny and glamorous, but there could be wars and there could be strife and there could also be indeed failure and defeat, which may not in poetic terms be accepted in great chivalry, but as a careful historical reader, you will be able to understand where those moments are. A good example of this kind of collective memory would be the genealogy. Now, the Abhyudayamu very interestingly starts with the narration of the entire genealogy of Vijayaraghava Nayaka, indeed of Raghunatha, but of course it starts also with Vijayaraghava himself. Right? So Tatacharya, who happens to be the Rajaguru, walks in and tells Vijayaraghava, listen, I know, Vijayaraghava had a dream the previous night where the goddess and the god Chengamalavalli and Rajagopala Swami appear in his dreams and say, why don't you write an Abhyudayamu? Now, you know that now when someone says, I had a dream last night and I'm to write, you know how to take that with a pinch of salt. Everybody knows, right? But whatever the case of that might be, he indeed embarks to write a Dvipada Kavya on his father. Now, Tatacharya gives him a long, beautiful Dvipada, which narrates the genealogical history of his family. It's like a family tree, starting from Sevappa onwards, right? And how they came from the Rayas of the Tuluva dynasty and how they later on became feudatories, earning a place of their own as sublords, etc., etc. Now, the question in a literary text, if we were to take it literally, would be, but if he's Rama and Krishna, why does he have to be a descendant of Sevappa and Achyutappa and etc., right? That's where the partly human and the partly divine presence really comes in, right? So there's also a very, very interesting, this particular text brings a very important socio-political narrative, which is that post the Tuluva dynasty taking over the Vijayanagara Empire, the ruling class really shifted. Until then, there were Kshatriyas who were ruling. But thereafter, especially the Nayakas, were not from the Kshatriya clan. They were all what they call themselves as Chaturtha Gotra Putra, the fourth Varna or the Shudra Varna, right? And they proclaim it with great dignity and self-assurance. So our idea that the fourth Varna has never ruled, has never been in the helm of affairs, and the fact that here was their opportunity to proclaim their identity amidst a long, unbroken chain of Kshatriya rule, really is brought forth in the Abhyudayamu. Because right at the very beginning, Tatacharya, as he begins to say, he says, Bhuja Vikramadhara Bhojavatara, Vijheragava Dhira Viradhivira, Vinavaya Ni Vamsa Vistaramella. And then he goes on to talk about, he says, let me tell you the genealogy. Nalava Jati Jagati. So he actually mentions them as the fourth Jati or the fourth Varna. And this, what we today call as Bahujan, although Bahujan is a term, Pali term that has been more generically used for people who are not from the first three Varnas. I use that today for better understanding. This Bahujan identity of the Nayaka is played up so identity, as we say, how do we understand? Is this not historical? Isn't this what historians do? Don't they look for antecedents of people? Right? He is not painted as the avatara after Rama or Krishna. If that was done, then this text should be thrown out of the window as a historical narrative. But it is historicity because as much as he is looked as Rama and Krishna, the partly human quality of Raghunatha is retained intact, so much so that his genealogy is also very historically placed. Who comes after whom? Sevappa's son is Achyutappa. Sevappa came to power because Achyuta Devaraya's wife was Sevappa's sister. So this entire genealogy was indeed narrated to Vijayaraghava. Not that Vijayaraghava wouldn't have known it before the text, but he makes it a point to place it as part of the text in the initial pages. And then he goes on to say that we belong to the Chaturtha Gotra. And thereafter in many other texts, including texts like Mannarudasa Vilasamu, which are all contemporary texts of the time, nobody is shying away from calling the Nayakas as Chaturtha Gotra Putras, right? And they are constantly, at the same time, they continue to fashion themselves as partly celestial, with a tinge of Rama, and with a tinge of, in fact, in the Ramaswamy temple that Raghunatha built, in the Garbhagraha, the shrine, there is the Rama and the Lakshmana and the Sita figure, and on the right there is a Hanuman, and the Hanuman is identified as Raghunatha himself. So he becomes a bhakta of Rama. So no matter that he is Rama himself in a text, he's also the bhakta of Rama. Look at the many fluid ways in which identities were traveling, right? And he holds a Ramayana in his hand to show that he was indeed also a great devotee of the Ramayana as a text and literature. Therefore, the genealogical segment of the Raghunatha Abhyudayamu, Vijayaraghava is instructed by his courtier, Guru Tatacharya, to include, and the whole genealogy really unapologetically brings their actual Bahujan social status, binding together several of the socio-political circumstances under which the Nayakas became feudatory lords. What is interesting is all the other communities that work with them, now the ruling class, the ways in which they shift in position, the ways in which their power shifts within this ecology. Because a non-ruling class suddenly become ruling class, right? So all the other communities are also shifting. Now it's like a musical chair. How do you understand this power structure shifting? In the way in which they're addressing each other, in the way in which they feature in their respective roles in this particular text. So these are all minute details that can be read if one is to pay that attention. I'll very quickly move into the performance itself. I'll also tell you how Raghunatha, for example, I'll give you one example of how I see the many war prowesses of Raghunatha. He wears what, in the morning when he wakes up, he wears, and I will be showing you this video clip, what is called the Gandapandara. Now, this Gandapandara is like an anklet of sorts, right? He says this, in this, he holds the crown jewel of the Pandyas. If this was a literary text, because I've seen people butcher even Jayadeva's Gita Govinda with absolutely very little understanding. So what you would do is only think of the Pandya king as the Tamil king. But in fact, that's not the reference. Raghunatha, at that time, Madurai was ruled by the Nayakas of Madurai. And he had won over them in a war just then and had extracted a crown jewel from their crown to his Gandapandara, to his anklet, to show the subordination. But also there is a metaphoric subordination. The Madurai Nayaks and the Pandya's daughter is brought in marriage to Raghunatha. So all of these are implied in just the reference to the Pandya jewel on the Gandapandara. Right? So such poetic verses are strewn with such examples. Now, what I'm going to do is, in the ritualization of the everyday life of the king, you will be able to read this culture, this historicity, but more importantly, in watching it as a performance, this memory starts embedding itself as cultural memory in the mind of the viewer. I know that we don't have the luxury of showing this to you over and over again, but I have the luxury of showing it to you at least once. So here I'm going to show you a very short excerpt of the opening. I mean, not the opening really of the text itself, but the opening of Raghunatha's day, because it's an Abhyudayamu. He wakes up in the morning and his toilet is very elaborate, right? He wakes up in the morning and he wears all these jewels and it's elaborate, and there are people who are, making sure he's wearing this jewelry and he's filling his ears with perfume, no less, so on and so forth. Now, I want, if you're a student of world history, compare this to Louis XIV's court in France. In order to bring a certain cultural memory to the Palace of Versailles, which he had built, and nobody was willing to live over there, none of the nobles and courtiers were willing to live, Louis XIV devised an entire elaborate ritualistic lifestyle around his everyday life. I mean, the person who holds his spitting spittoon and the person who holds his frills, the one who holds his shoes, all of them are courtiers and noble people. And the closer you are, the more nastier your personal your job is, the more closer you become. That's what they say, right? So that's very true of Louis XIV. So if you're a world history buff, you know what I'm talking about. Around the same time, here was Raghunatha Nayaka's life that was highly dramatized, highly ritualistic, highly public. When he wakes up in the morning and he's wearing his loin cloth, there are 15 people standing there, observing how that beautiful cloth is tied around his waist, how he's applying oil on his body. So all of these public rituals, remember the images, the rituals, all of these contribute to cultural memory. And ultimately, cultural memory translates to historical memory. So I'm going to share with you this short excerpt that I have, which wait, I think in leaving the meeting, I may have accidentally, there it is. Hang on. If you're able to, you will be able to see my screen. Are you able to see it? Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, is the audio there?
No, ma'am, you have to select share sound in the options.
I did that. Of course I did that.
If it is a link, can you share to me, or otherwise I will share on your behalf?
Yeah, why not? I can do that. Terrible is this? So this is an excerpt of the opening lines of Raghunatha's morning life. And you will be able to hear in this place how Raghunatha goes about his morning life. And this is a translation in English for those of you who can't enjoy the beautiful Telugu, but the Telugu is so pristine, so beautiful, that you don't even have to understand it. Yes, so it's sent to you. So we might be able to see it in just a moment.
on a dress and ornaments for the darbar. The process of his toilet was elaborate. In front of him was placed a large-sized mirror in an erect position, supported by a damsel of handsome appearance. Servants of the treasury stood by his side with golden trays filled with ornaments. First, he decked his hair with garlands of sampangi flowers and wore upon them a costly kullai or cap, ornamented handsomely with large suppani pearls. He then adorned himself with bracelets and large earring sets with lustrous gems. He next smeared his body with fresh saffron paste and filled his ears with perfume. Having thus decorated and perfumed himself, Raghunatha put on a half shirt made of paitini cloth and tied around his loins a beautiful garment of golden yellow silk. He wore necklaces, armlets, rings, brilliant with gems of various kinds, and fastened on his ankle a Gandapandara, an anklet of the heroes, set with precious stones extracted from the crown of the Pandya king, Nayaks of Madurai. As soon as he finished his toilet, he proceeded, led by two damsels, each holding him by a hand and accompanied by his two queens, Kalavatamma on the left and Lakshmamma on the right, to the audience hall, Indira Mandiramu.
Yeah, I think we can pause there. Right. So as you can see, the description is vivid. The details are minute. You know the size of the pearls. You know the gems that went into the necklace. You know that the cap was called a kullai. It was not called by any other term, so it was a borrowed term from Sultanate. So there are so many fragments of historical narration that are strewn even in such a short passage. The language that's employed. And what is even more critical is, as you read this, you may just read this as, verse and move on. But when it's performed, it is reiterated over and over again in your mind. You're even as the narration, if you listen to it once, if you're somebody who has vivid imaginations, you might be imagining a king, right? And of course, I had left an image there of Raghunatha from one of the temples, standing with his wives. But even without that image, you'll be able to imagine what this person, this Raghunatha, would look like. But imagine having to live in a time where Raghunatha was indeed present and this was being performed every day. You look at him, even if he's dressed in the rags of the day, your mind is going to embed on it the memory of this grandiosity. And that is a creation of history. It's a contemporary creation of history. That's very, very critical to understanding how India was indeed historical and not ahistorical. So the configuration of a prestigious image is a very shrewd and erudite game played by the author, whether it's Vijayaraghavan Nayaka in this case or any other author. It comes with great passion, intentness. The characters in the Yakśagānamu, in this particular case, it's a Yakśagānamu, are playing such delicate games. For example, the courtesan and the king play such delicate games or mind games of social games. For example, in the Darbar Hall, there are ministers and noble and courtiers speaking different languages. And at one point, Raghunatha says, each of you speak in your own native language. So there is a Tamil person, there is a Saurashtra person, there is a Telugu person, and he takes great joy in seeing all their ideas colliding. Vijayaraghava very cleverly places his father, and he doesn't do this for gratis. I mean, Vijayaraghava needs to, and all biographies are in some sense, at least courtly biographies, have a purpose. The purpose is to establish a legitimate bloodline for their own selves. Unless Raghunatha is hailed and extolled as a very legitimate ruling bloodline, Vijayaraghava's position is not secure. But of course, that is not the only reason why somebody does it, but that cannot be overlooked. Right? Vijayaraghava places his father in this reverential, deified mold in order so that he can write his explicit erotic exploits. Even as you saw this very mundane, everyday morning ritual, there was so much of romanticization of the daily life. I mean, we all wake up in the morning, get ready and come out. Nobody is writing poetry on that, right? So the romanticizing of everyday life, the idea that there is sensuality and sexuality in this divinized image really reflects on multiple levels a certain double consciousness. That can also be true of their historicity and their literary interest. In fact, it's said that the Nayaka court people were all preoccupied with music and dance. That may be their way of life, but not to say that there was no historical understanding or historical consciousness. They did not for a minute believe that Raghunatha was the descendant of Rama or Krishna, but they never hesitated in divinizing him to a point where he was an ideal, but he was also capable of all the sensual pleasures that were surrounding them. So desire, bhakti and bhoga and service and devotion were all intermingling with one another. Very much like how we want to live our lives today, right? Today, we want to be many things. Our identities are not confined by just the one thing. We may go to a temple on the first day, but we may also go and spend a time and party with our friends the next day, right? But how do we want the public to remember us? How do we want public images to be built? After all, histories are built on those kind of deliberate public imagery. Where better to look than into literary texts? And what better way to reiterate this historical, cultural, collective memory than in the repetitiveness of performance? I have reconstructed Raghunatha Abhyudayamu as a performative work to be performed, to be narrated, to be recited, to be sung and danced, complete with all its elements. That's a work, that's a full-length work. But the writing that I have done, which hopefully will see the day of light of day in a few months, which brings out this performing histories as a legitimate critical theory that I put forth to the understanding that along with many other Indian literary texts that have already made it to, being considered as historical resources, performative texts, purely performative texts of the past also have a tremendous scope to be read as historical narratives. Friends, I think I'd like to conclude here and throw open the floor for questions. I know that the topic has been a bit tense, but hopefully the beauty of Raghunatha Abhyudayamu has lightened the space for us to engage in this. And thank you very much again.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. I think with your narration, we were taken back in history. We were learning history. We were understanding so many aspects of it. Thank you so much. I would like to express my gratitude to everybody who has joined us today for their presence and interactive contribution. And I extend my gratitude to you, ma'am, for taking out time from your busy schedule to grace this event. We'll move towards the question answers round now. Anyone who wants to ask any question live, you can use the virtual raise hand option. If you want to ask your question in person, you please use the virtual raise hand option and we'll allow you to unmute and ask the question. Meanwhile, we'll take the questions from the chat box. If you do not want to come live, you can put your question in the chat box itself. So before I take any question from the chat box, ma'am, I had one doubt. I just wanted to, ask you. So our history is very rich. Our culture is very rich. We see so much of knowledge, so much of history engraved in temples. And I believe with whatever I have known until now, very little, very minute, that our ancestors are they were so knowledgeable. They were their culture that was so rich, and they tried to communicate that to us in various forms, through literature, through sculptures, through engraving the temples, through these dance forms. And slowly with time, it is not being taken forward in the capacity that has been communicated by them to us. So how should we, like, what is the current status? Like, if I being a millennial, I want to know more about it, or I want to make sure that yes, it is being carried forward, or we are also getting involved in performative history. We also getting to know so much. Do we need to, kind of include it in a school curriculum, so that right from the beginning, even the students, so if we all get to know about it, if it would have been there in our school, like if we would have been told that yes, you can learn history from these beautiful poems or these beautiful literature and these beautiful sculptures, dances, how should we keep these alive?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, how, the one thing that, if you remember earlier in this conversation, I said that the native reader, right, who understands, who's part of that ecology. So we are native readers because we are Indians in some sense, and we belong to. I mean, for example, if I'm talking about a Telugu text, you're all in Telugu-speaking land. So for you, the idea that it's closer to home is very true, but that is not a native reader. A native reader is someone who can actually locate the circumstances of such writing, who can appreciate the kind of narratives that are said in that. We are all native readers of Facebook and social media today because we are all using it actively, right? To know of its existence and to live in its contemporary time is one thing, but to actually actively use it, right? You have a certain advantage. You have a certain insider understanding of things, right? Even if it's not entirely told to you, you have a certain intuitive understanding. My not just suggestion here, but everywhere is, if we want to, as a generation, start appreciating and engaging with our history, culture, art, performance, whatever it may be, I think we owe it to ourselves to engage with the local language, with the vernacular languages of this country. There are so many languages. Language is the key to opening many, many doors. So it's not enough if you say, I understand the language, you must develop a love and proficiency in languages, to the point where you engage with that culture through that language. Right. So, and I say this to my students, even when they travel abroad. I mean, it's a great opportunity. If you're living somewhere for a few years, if you're living in Germany for a few years, learn German, right? It's important for because language will immediately connect you, and you become a native reader with that ecology the minute that happens. So that's very critical. So learning many languages would be a great way to start for all of us.
Yeah. Okay, so taking the questions from the chat box. Thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful explanation, first of all. So someone asked, what is the importance of performance history? I think
performance history is different from performing history. So I think that is a very subtle distinction. Performance history is the history of performance itself, which really could be looking at the trajectories through which performances have traveled, whether it be people, places, different political, social, cultural contexts, etc. But performing histories, which is what I've titled today's conversation, is a very unique way of reading history. You are performing history. You're not, when I use the word reading, you can use it interchangeably with performing. You always read history, right? You always write history or read history. But we in this country, not just in this country, but also in several other countries, even Louis XIV's court in some ways was performing history, right? We are also people who perform history. We've performed our history because history is a collection of memories, as I said, cultural memories. So performing history is an ongoing. We also perform history today, believe me, right? So yeah, so those are the two distinctions.
I think another question is about how this should be taken to the future generations. You already answered. Anyone need to get involved, know more about their native language. Yeah. And also, I believe in today's times, using social media, someone who is expert in that knowledge should communicate in a form, like should build up content in a way that reaches out to that the new target audience as well. So that is also one medium through which we can reach out to the future generations, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Next questions. So why cultural memory is slowly vanishing? Cultural memory is slowly vanishing.
Sorry, I think there's a hand that's raised, and then there are some questions on the chat box. Shall I take them or what?
Yes, ma'am. The question that I read now was, why
Oh, that was the
cultural
question.
memory?
I thought that was half a sentence. Sorry.
No, so sorry. Why cultural memory is slowly vanishing?
Oh, why is cultural memory slowly? No. That's interesting because cultural memory can never vanish. Everybody has some or the other cultural memory. Specific cultural memories are overwritten by new sets of cultural memories all the time. Right? Like that's why I said, if you have a memory of your own as a child, some 10 years since then, your memory of that will fade and change. New characters would have come. You'd suddenly say, no, my mother was there. And somebody would say, what? Your mother was in Bangalore at that time. You say, really? But I always felt like my mother was there. So, your memory really shifts and changes. It also becomes more desirable and acceptable to you. That's what psychology says, right? You make your memories more acceptable to you, right? So cultural memory is always rewritten or overwritten. What performance does, essentially, and that's a great question, because what performance does is the span of a particular cultural memory is sustained by repetition. You repeat. Imagine you have a birthday party and you have the same birthday party the same way for 10 years. The memory of that is going to last much longer than one birthday party that happened 10 years ago. So the repetition really embeds memory.
So we'll take question from Mr. Ajish Menon. You were raising your hand. Do you want to ask your question, Mr. Menon?
Akka, namaste, Akka.
Yes.
So you have been talking about the reconstruction of the Dvipada that you have already worked, Rara. But how is that relevant to show that, okay, there is a history in that Dvipadam? So you have taken a phrase and you were explaining about how there is a Kullai, there are certain vernacular references, we make out history. But from a music of, let's say, the way you have reconstructed in Shankarabharanam, if my memory is right, that you have performed, how will that give us history? How will that literature give us history? Can you detail about that, Akka?
First of all, the Dvipadam is part of... You have to mute your mic. I think it's echoing. So first of all, the Dvipadam is part of a larger work, right? It's not a standalone, right? So you can't take small phrases or small poetries and imagine that they have a historical... They might at many places, but this is part of a much larger work. And you're excerpting it. I mean, see, today we are not... If I'm to perform the Raghunatha Abhyudayamu entirely, which is what I do now, then you will understand that in the scheme of things, how this particular Dvipada also fits in. But the question about raga, now the raga are, again, that is, the ragas are all dictated by the text itself. If I were to go for if I'm talking about the Abhyudayamu, this particular Abhyudayamu, for example, Vijayaraghava himself says this has to be sung in Ghanta, this has to be sung in Saurashtra, this has to be in Atatalam, whatever, right? But then there are no notations. You don't have the exact memory of how Ghanta sounded in the 17th century, which will lead you to other musical texts of the time that can then help you actually reconstruct Ghanta as sung then. Or if you don't want to take the trouble, you can sing the Ghanta that you know and still be done with it. But the idea is the historicity lies in the sequential narration of an entire incident from the dawn to dusk. The one Dvipada that I sang, the Ra Rajani that I sang, is a very singular 4 lines, which are narrative of Raghunatha's greatness. It by itself, it may not give you any historicity, but in the context, for example, this particular, what is the relevance of Ra Rajani? The relevance of the Ra Rajani Dvipada is that the court of Raghunatha, when he was asking his 2 great female poetesses, Pasupaleti Rangajamma and Madhuravani, to sing, right? They asked Ramabhadramma and Madhuravani. They both composed this particular. I think it was Ramabhadramma who composed this Dvipada in both Sanskrit and later on in Prakrit. So that is historical, because there you understand the historicity of when and where this was done and what is the prowess of the kinds of courtiers in the court of Raghunatha. Now that's historical, right? Did I answer that question? No.
Yes, ma'am. So the next question is, could you explain about the subaltern's performance history in the history of Tamil Nadu?
That's a very vastly different question. Unfortunately, I think not of this topic, but I'll just quickly say that what I mean by subaltern and subalternism itself, has come under a lot of the scanner in the last few years, and I also critically engage with it. Those forms of art in the context of history and art that have those narratives that have been set aside or overlooked in some sense to bring more dominant narratives of the same event. In performance history, what is subalternism in Tamil Nadu is, the classic example is, of course, the Devadasi narrative, which is another topic altogether. But in the context of, say, a text like this, for example, a vernacular text. Now, we have the habit of advantaging Sanskritic texts over vernacular texts often, right? We do that. Many of us do that. We think that a vernacular Ramayana is only second best to, say, Valmiki's Ramayana, without realizing that the vernacular Ramayana is vastly different and is extremely connected to the immediate cultural ecology of the place. If you go to Bodi Nayakanur in Tamil Nadu, the Ramayana series there that you will see embodies the immediate ritualistic lives of how a marriage, like the Rama and Sita Swayamvara and the marriage, reflects the life of the people who were in the Nayaka times at that time. It's gorgeous. That you will miss in the dominant narrative. I think that's what subalternism is. I hope but that's another question altogether, Dr. Kamakshi. I hope we can find another time.
Yeah. So Mr. Santosh Ramal is also raising hand. I'll now please come on video, and if you can ask your question live.
Hi, Akka. It was a really nice talk. I wanted to know, how do we sort of extract, history from this sort of exaggerated narrative, right? Because, the victors usually write the history and create this narrative. So sometimes, like, for example, Ravana is usually embedded in our cultural memory as this very demonic, evil king. And then you have, offsetting narratives from like Sri Lanka, which says like he was a really kind person. And like, how do we sort of bring balance to this, this sort of conflicting cultural memories, the one written by the victors and the one written by the other side.
Yeah. So I think that's the entirety of what I was going for. So the idea that, history can be sieved from literatures, and performative literatures particularly, and performance in particular. Let's take the example of performance, right? So in contemporary times, so you watch a particular dancer perform many times. If she's very popular or if he's very popular, and you get to see them perform, say 100 concerts over someone else who's a better performer perhaps, but is only performing once, right? So naturally the times will, not the paper times, but like our times will record in history, in the public memory, that this was the greatest dancer of our time, the one who's appeared more, right? But as a discerning audience, you or anyone else who avidly looks out for multiple other people will know that there is a better performer out there in time, right? So somewhere someone is recording history. You yourself said there is a narrative here of Ravana, but there are narratives in other parts of the world, not other parts of India. Why go all the way to Sri Lanka? Right? Even in India, if you go to Assam, you have a narrative of Ravana being a much more glorified, and not an anti-hero at all, right? So the native reader is a subject, right? So they are intuitively in understanding of what's happening. That's why you always cultivate the native reader. You're always looking for an audience, right? You're always trying to convince a group of people that what you are saying is the truth and what you are doing is the best. This every writer will do. Right? Every performer will do. I will try to capture through my performance, and I will do as many performances, all the audience in the world. But the truth is, I will not find all the audience in the world in my space. That's true of Vijayaraghavan Nayaka too. So the Raghunatha Abhyudayamu, which is supposed to be the literature of the victor, is not the only narrative that is there. There is Ramabhadramba's version of the Abhyudayamu. There is Rangajamma's Mannarudasa Vilasamu. There are other works, Soma Kavi's work. So if we want to parallelly sieve through the ecology of that space, you as a reader must become a discerning reader. At this point, if you're engaging with a particular text or a particular performance or a particular narrative, you are a native, you are a willing audience, as Coleridge said. Right? Your suspension of disbelief is willing. But if you were not, if you are a more discerning, if you're a historian, if you're a performance historian, if you're somebody who's engaged in this at a more academic level, you will spread your wings and look for other narratives. So therefore, for you, the idea of the victor and the narrative of the victor alone will not hold good. Then you will be presenting a very different narrative, which is what many people have done. Like for every war victory that one side has claimed, there is always a narrative on the other side. If it hasn't met your eye, then I think it has to meet your eye. I mean, this is true of all of us.
Okay. So now I think we have, from these questions, we have covered most of it. And even in your talk, you have discussed most of these questions that are being asked.
Yeah.
So we'll move towards closing this session. I think there were a lot of glitch that has happened, and people are saying. So sorry. So sometimes we have to live through the technical glitch. That's how the pros and cons of technology work. So sorry about that, but we are sure that you are able to take a lot of value out of this session. And while we move towards the end, I would like to mention something about Vishwa, the idea behind it. So Vishwa is an online platform for everyday change makers and social champions. It's a crowdfunding and a crowdsourcing platform that is aimed at helping anyone find the support they need in their efforts to have dreams for themselves and for others, and in the process, make the world a better place. If you feel strongly connected with this cause, please visit our website www.wishwa.org. You will find various ways through which either you can help others, or if someone needs help for an NGO or individual, they can seek help through that. For the idea of the vision behind WishwaTalks is that we believe even a single talk is able to bring difference in one's life, is able to impart knowledge, and when we are having change makers and experts like ma'am and others experts who join us, we are sure that the value that we are deriving from the talks every Saturday brings a lot of difference in the society. And of course, we do not, there is no charge inclusive for these. So the vision for our founder, Mrs. Shivani, for the Vishwa Talks was that she as a child was always surrounded by prominent figures, and she understood that, due to which her thought process was very different from her peers. The prominent figures, the interactions with them made her realize her dream, made her realize the value of the life, and also that her vision, her life should also be dedicated towards others. There should be a social platform where through which people should be able to help others. Because today, in today's time, we know that we can help others. We know there is someone out there that needs help, but we do not know how to reach out to them. We do not know if our help is sufficient, or is our help even being is being utilized properly. So the hence Vishwa platform is there right now in Hyderabad, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana overall. And we are here to support anyone and everyone who is in need. And in that process, building up a community which in turn will help these NGOs and individuals. We are also launching Vishwa Talks Junior and Vishwa Talks Youth. Vishwa Talks Junior is a platform specially designed for young minds of today. Our little ones have a natural curiosity to explore the vastness of the world around them. At Vishwa Talks, we aim to create this safe space for that exploration by inviting experts in various fields to share their insights and knowledge on various topics: Indian culture, rich heritage, arts, science, history, and more. We want to encourage big ideas and deep questions. Vishwa Talks Youth is a space where we facilitate expert-led conversation on a variety of topics that are relevant to the youth of today, such as our physical and mental health, environment management, and climate change, rich history and culture of our country. We believe in the power of a single talk to inspire a whole generation. Our goal with every Vishwa Talk is to empower the youth with new relevant knowledge and offer the opportunity to connect with change makers and be the change makers of the world around them. So if you have a child, if you know, or if you are a part of a school, your school or your child can register for Vishwa Talks Junior. A college or a youth can register for Vishwa Talks Youth, and they can derive value every week and meet change makers, talk to them, understand their point of view, get clarity about life, get clarity about various topics that we will be dealing at hand. Apart from that, on our platform, like I said, it's a social integrated platform. You can come and donate materials like clothes, books, furnitures, anything that you think that it's not of a use for you now, and anyone can make use out of it. It would help others. You can please come and donate. If you think that there is an NGO or an individual out there who is in need of material, you can come to the website and you can request for that material. Right now, this platform is in Hyderabad. Materials, the request and delivery of these is in Hyderabad. To make sure that we are part of this community, you can also please join Vishwa Champion of Social Change. By joining this community, you would be part of the community. You will be able to interact and help anyone in all ways possible. Please visit our website to see the cause that you would like to support, to see the fundraisers that you want to support. For an example, building toilet for school children. There are some girls who have to go to their neighbors' houses for using washroom. There is no proper sanitation or a proper toilet in their school. If there's many such fundraisers on our website, please visit our website and donate as little or as much as you can. And it would definitely is going to help change someone's life. Our next talk is next Saturday on August 6th, 11 a.m. is with Gayatri Ublapati. It is on self-doubt to self-acceptance. It's on mental health cause. We are going to learn how are we going to blossom from a past of self-doubt into future of self-love and happiness. Please, the link is in the chat box. If you want to attend that session, you can register here. If you want to stay updated with all upcoming Vishwa Talks, please subscribe for Vishwa Talks, and you will get all the informations on WhatsApp, emails, and however you want. You can select those options. Thank you so much. Thank you, Swarnamalya ma'am, for taking out time and gracing us with your presence today. It was very lovely for you to say yes and coming us for the second time. Thank you so much, ma'am, for your talk and the love.
Pleasure is absolutely mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Vishwa team, for managing through all the glitches. I would now request you, ma'am, please join the breakout room. Thank you, audience, for joining us today.